Rant reading A Serial Killer. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, March 17, 1942 to May 10, 1994, was an American serial killer and sex offender who assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, personas he had devised. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public service as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. Gacy committed all of his murders inside his ranch-style house near Norridge, a village in Norwood Park Township in suburban Chicago. Typically, he would lure a victim to his home and dupe him into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. He would then assault and torture his captive before killing him by either asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. 4 were discarded in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was convicted of sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa in 1968 and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment but served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972, had murdered twice more by the end of 1975, and murdered at least 30 subsequent victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Des Plaines teenager Robert Peast led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. His conviction for 33 murders by one individual then covered the most homicides in United States legal history. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. On death row at Menard Correctional Center, he spent much of his time painting. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942, the second child and only son of John Stanley Gacy and Maureen Elaine Robinson. His father was an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. Gacy was of Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. His parental grandparents, who spelled the family name as Gataz or Gesa, had immigrated to the United States from Poland and part of the German state of Prussia. Childhood. Gacy was close to his mother and 2 sisters, but endured a difficult relationship with his father, an alcoholic who was physically abusive to his family. His father would belittle him, calling him dumb and stupid and comparing him unfavorably with his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was his father beating him with a leather belt for accidentally disarranging components of a car engine he had assembled. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which only resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up to be queer. Despite this mistreatment, however, Gacy still loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy had been caught sexually fondling a young girl. His father whipped him with a razor strop as punishment. The same year, a family friend and contractor would sometimes molest Gacy in his truck. Gacy never told his father about this, afraid that his father would blame him. Gacy was an overweight and unathletic child because of a heart condition. He was told to avoid all sports at school. During the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts. He was hospitalized on occasion because of these episodes, and also in 1957 for a burst appendix. Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he had spent almost a year in hospital and attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. His father suspected these episodes were an effort to gain sympathy and attention and openly accused his son of faking the condition as Gacy lay in a hospital bed. Although his mother's sisters and a few close friends never doubted his illness, Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. One of Gacy's friends in high school recalled several instances when his father ridiculed or beat his son without provocation. On one occasion in 1957, he witnessed Gacy's father emerging drunk from the family basement to begin belittling and then hitting his son for no apparent reason. Gacy's mother attempted to intervene as her son simply put his hands up to defend himself. According to the friend, Gacy never struck his father back during these altercations. Career origins. In 1960, at age 18, Gacy became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood. This led to more criticism of his father, who accused his son of being a pasty. Gacy later speculated his decision to become involved in politics was actually to seek the acceptance from others that he never received from his father. The same year, Gacy's political involvement began, his father bought him a car. He kept the vehicle's title in his own name until Gacy had finished paying for it. These monthly payments took several years for him to complete. His father would confiscate the keys to the vehicle if Gacy did not do as he said. In April 1962, Gacy purchased an extra set of keys after his father confiscated the original set. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the component for 3 days. Gacy recalled he felt totally sick and drained after this incident. Las Vegas. Hours after his father replaced the distributor cap, Gary left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada. He found work within the ambulance service before he was transferred to work as an attendant at a Palm mortuary. As a mortuary attendant, Gacy slept on a cot behind the embalming room. He worked there for 3 months, observing morticians, embalming dead bodies, and occasionally serving as a pallbearer. Gacy later confessed that one evening while alone, he had clambered into the coffin of a deceased teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This prompted Gacy to call his mother the next day and ask whether his father would allow him to return home. His father agreed. The same day, he drove back to Chicago. Springfield. On returning home, Gacy enrolled at Northwestern Business College despite having failed to graduate from high school. He graduated in 1963 and took a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. In 1964, the shoe company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a salesman, and eventually promoted him to manager of his department. In March of that year, he became engaged to Marilyn Myers, a co-worker. During their courtship, Gacy joined the local Jaycees and worked tirelessly for them, being named key man in April 1964. That same year, he had his second homosexual experience. According to Gacy, after one of his colleagues in the Springfield Jaycees piled him with drinks and invited him to spend the evening on a sofa, he agreed. The colleague then performed oral sex on him while he was drunk. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield Jaycees. The same year, he was named the third most outstanding Jaycee in the state of Illinois. Waterloo, Iowa. KFC manager. After a 6-month courtship, Gacy and Myers married in September 1964. Marilyn's father subsequently purchased 3 KFCs, Kentucky Fried Chickens, restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' former home, which had been vacated for the couple. The offer was lucrative. Gacy would receive $15,000 per year, the equivalent of about $134,000 as of 2022, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. Following the obligatory completion of management course, Gacy relocated to Waterloo with his wife. He opened a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes at his restaurants, he socialized only with the young men. Gacy gave them many of them alcohol before he had made sexual advances. If they rebuked him, he would claim his advances were simply jokes or tests of morals. Gacy's wife gave birth to a son in February 1966 and a daughter in March 1967. Gacy later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When Gacy's parents paid a family visit in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the physical and emotional abuse he had inflicted throughout his son's childhood and as adolescence, before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you," as he shook Gacy's hand. Waterloo Jaycees. In Waterloo, Gacy joined the local Jaycees chapter, regularly offering extended hours to the organization. In addition to the 12 and 14 hours he worked managing the KFC restaurants. At meetings, Gacy often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and other Waterloo Jaycees were also deeply involved in wife swapping, prostitution, pornography, and drug use. Although Gacy was considered ambitious and something of a regret, the other Jaycees held him in high regard for his fundraising work, and in 1967 named him Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo Jaycees. The same year, Gacy served on the board of directors. Assault of Donald Voorhees. In August 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, the son of fellow Gacy. Gacy lured Voorhees to his house upon the promise of showing him heterosexual stag films, regularly played at Jaycee's events. Gacy plied Voorhees with alcohol, allowed him to watch a stag movie, then persuaded him to engage in mutual oral sex, adding, "And you have to have sex with the man before you start having sex with the woman." Over the following months, Gacy similarly abused several other youths, including one whom he encouraged to have sex with his own wife before blackmailing him to perform oral sex on him. Gacy tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments. in the interest of scientific research and paid them up to $50 each. In March 1968, Voorhees reported to his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Voorhees Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and subsequently charged him with performing oral sodomy on Voorhees in an attempted assault of a 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy vehemently denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. The results indicated Gacy was nervous when he denied any wrongdoing in relation to both young men. Gacy publicly denied any wrongdoing and insisted the charges against him were politically motivated. Voorhees Sr. had opposed Gacy's nomination for appointment as the president of the Iowa Jaycees. Several fellow Jaycees found Gacy's story credible and rallied to his support. However, on May 10, 1968, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charge. On August 30th, 1968, Gacy persuaded one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, to physically assault Voorhees in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying against him in court. Gacy promised to pay Schroeder $300. Schroeder agreed and early in September lured Voorhees to an isolated country park, sprayed mace in his eyes, and beat him. Voorhees escaped and reported the assault to the police, identifying Schroeder as his attacker. They arrested him the following day. While initially denying any involvement, Schroeder soon confessed to assaulting Voorhees, indicating he had done at Gacy's request. Police arrested Gacy and laid an additional charge of hiring Schroeder to assault and intimidate Voorhees against him. On September 12th, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the Psychiatric Hospital of the University of Iowa. The two doctors examined him over a period of 17 days before concluding he had an antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for sociopathy or psychopathy. He was unlikely to benefit from any therapy or medical treatment, and that his behavior pattern was likely to bring him into repeated conflict with society. The doctors concluded he was mentally competent to stand trial. On November 7, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to one count of sodomy in relation to Voorhees, but not guilty to the charges related to other use. Gacy claimed Voorhees had offered himself to him and that he had acted out of curiosity. His story was not believed. Gacy was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment to be served at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. That same day, Gacy's wife petitioned for divorce, requesting she had been awarded the couple's home property, sole custody of their 2 children, and alimony. The court ruled in her favor, and the divorce was finalized on September 18, 1969. Gacy never saw his first wife or children again. During his incarceration in the Anamosa State Penitentiary, Gacy rapidly acquired a reputation as a model prisoner. Within months of his arrival, he had risen to the position of head cook. He had also joined the inmate JC chapter and increased its membership from 50 to 650 men in less than 18 months. He is known to have secured and increased the inmates' daily pay in the prison's mess hall and to have supervised several projects to improve conditions for inmates for the prison. By the summer of 1969, Gacy had overseen the installation of miniature golf courses in the prison recreation yard. In June 1969, Gacy was denied parole. To prepare for a second scheduled parole hearing in May 1970, he completed 16 high school courses, for which he obtained his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day 1969, Gacy's father died from cirrhosis of the liver. When informed of his father's death, Gacy collapsed to the floor, sobbing. His request for supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral was denied. Returned to Chicago. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months probation on June 18, 1970, after having served 18 months of his 10-year sentence. Conditions of his probation including that Gacy relocate to Chicago and live with his mother, and that he must observe a 10 o'clock curfew. On his release, Gacy told friend and fellow J.C. Clarence Lane, who picked him up from the prison, he had remained steadfast in his belief, Gacy's innocence, that he would never go back to jail, and that he intended to reestablish himself in Waterloo. However, within 24 hours of release, Gacy had relocated to Chicago. He had arrived there on June 19th and shortly thereafter obtained a job as a short-order cook in a restaurant. On February 12, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that he had lured him into his car at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal and driven him to his home, where he had attempted to force the boy into sex. The court dismissed his complaint when the boy failed to appear. On June 22nd, Gacy was arrested and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct. The arrest was in response to a complaint filed by a youth who claimed that Gacy had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into this car, and forced him to perform oral sex. These charges were dropped after the complainant attempted to blackmail Gacy. The Iowa Board of Parole did not learn of these incidents, and 8 months later, in October 1971, Gacy's parole ended. The following month, the records of Gacy's previous criminal convictions were sealed. With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought a ranch house near the village of Norwood in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area of Cook County itself, a part of metropolitan Chicago. He resided at the address 8213 West Somerdale Avenue until his arrest in December 1978, and according to Gacy, committed all his murders there. Gacy was active in his local community and helpful towards his neighbors. He willingly loaned his construction tools and plowed snow from neighbor walkways free of charge. Between 1974 and 1978, he hosted annual summer parties, each devoted to a particular theme. These events were attended by up to 400 people, including politicians, second marriage, and divorce. In August 1971, shortly after Gacy and his mother moved into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school. They were married on July 1st, 1972. Carol and her two young daughters from a previous marriage moved into Gacy's home soon after the couple announced their engagement. His mother moved out of the house shortly before the wedding. By 1975, Gacy had told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had sex on Mother's Day that year, he informed her that this would be the last time they would ever have sex. He began spending most of the evenings away from home, only to return in the early hours of the morning with the excuse he had been working late. Carol observed Gacy bringing teenage boys into his garage in the early hours and also found gay pornography and men's wallets and identification inside the house. When she confronted Gacy about whose these items belonged to, he informed her angrily that it was none of her business. Following a heated argument when she failed to balance a checkbook correctly in October 1975, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed to his wife's request, although by mutual consent she continued to live at the West Somerdale house until February 1976, when she and her daughters moved into their own apartment. 1 month later, on March 2nd, the Gacy's divorce, decreed upon the false grounds of Gacy's infidelity with women, was finalized. PDM contractors. In 1971, Gacy established a part-time construction business, PDM Contractors. The initials PDM were for painting, decorating, and maintenance. With the approval of his probation officer, Gacy worked evenings on his construction contracts while working as a cook during the day. Initially, he undertook minor repair work such as sign writing, pouring concrete, and redecorating, but later expanded to include projects such as interior design, remodeling, installation, assembly, and landscaping. In mid-1973, Gacy quit his job as a cook so he could commit fully to his construction business. By 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly, and Gacy was working up to 16 hours per day. In March 1977, he became a supervisor for PE Systems, a firm specializing in the remodeling of drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, Gacy worked on up to 4 projects simultaneously and frequently traveled to other states. By 1978, PDM's annual revenue was over $200,000. Through his membership in a local moose club, Gacy became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members regularly performed at fundraising events and parades in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the clown club and created his own clown characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, devising his own makeup and costumes. He described Pogo as a happy clown, whereas Patches was a more serious character. Gacy seldom earned money for his performances and later said that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. He performed as both Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, and children's hospitals. Sometimes Gacy would remain in his clowning garb after a performance and briefly drink at a local bar before returning home. Gacy's volunteer public service as a clown throughout the years of his murders led him to being known as the Killer Clown. Employees. Much of PDM's workforce consisted of high school students and young men. Gacy would often proposition his workers for sex or insist on sexual favors in return for acts, such as lending his vehicle, financial assistance, or promotions. Gacy also claimed to own guns, once telling an employee, "Do you know how easy it would be for me to get one of my guns and kill you, and how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" In 1973, Gacy and a teenage employee traveled to Florida to view a property Gacy had purchased. On the first night in Florida, Gacy assaulted the employee in their hotel room. After returning to Chicago, this employee drove to Gacy's house and beat him in his yard. Gacy told his wife he had been attacked for refusing to pay him for poor quality painting work. In May 1975, Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Antonetti. 2 months later, he went to Antonetti's home, knowing the youth had injured his foot in an accident the previous day. The two drank a bottle of wine, then watched a heterosexual stag film before Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. Once cuff was loose, and Antonetti freed his arm while Gacy was out of the room. When Gacy returned, Antonetti, a high school wrestler, pounced upon him. He wrestled Gacy to the floor, obtained possession of the handcuff key, and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. At first, Gacy threatened Antonetti, then calmed down and promised to leave if he would remove the handcuffs. Antonetti agreed, and Gacy left. Antonetti recalled Gacy told him, "Not only are you the only one who got off out of the handcuffs, you got them on me." On July 26, 1976, Gacy picked up 18-year-old David Cram as he hitchhiked on Elston Avenue. Gacy offered him a job with PDM, and he began to work the same evening. On August 21st, Cram moved into his house. The next day, Cram and Gacy had several drinks to celebrate his 19th birthday, with Gacy dressed as Pogo. Gacy coned Cram into donning handcuffs. His wrists were cuffed in front of his body rather than behind. He swung Cram around while holding the chain linking the cuffs. Then he intended to assault him. Cram kicked Gacy in the face and freed himself from the handcuffs. A month later, Gacy appeared at Cram's bedroom door intending to assault him, saying, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." Cram resisted, straddling Gacy, who left the bedroom, stating, "You ain't no fun." Cram moved out on October 5th and left PDM. Although he did periodically work for Gacy over the following 2 years. Shortly after Cram moved out of Gacy's house, another employee, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved in. Rossi had worked for PDM since May 1976. He lived with Gacy until April 1977. Rossi sometimes assisted Gacy in clowning at grand openings of businesses, Gacy as Pogo and Rossi as Patches. Gacy also entered local Democratic Party politics, initially offering use of his employees to the Clean Party headquarters at no charge. He was rewarded for his community service with an appointment to serve in the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee, subsequently earning the title of precinct captain. In 1975, Gacy was appointed director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, an event he was supervised until 1978. Through his work with the parade, Gacy met and was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter on May 6, 1978. The event later became an embarrassment to the United States Secret Service. In the picture, Gacy is wearing an S-pen, indicating a person given special clearance. Murders. Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys and buried 26 of them in the crawl space of his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Bughouse Square, or simply off the streets with the promise of a job with PDM, an offer of drink and or drugs, or money or sex. Some victims were grabbed by force, others conned into believing Gacy, who often carried a sheriff's badge, a spotlight on his black Oldsmobile, was a policeman. Gacy usually lured a lone victim to his house, although on more than one occasion Gacy also had what he called doubles. 2 victims killed in the same evening. Inside Gacy's home, his usual modus operandi was to ply youth with drink, drugs, or generally gain his trust. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs to show a magic trick. Sometimes as part of a clowning routine, he typically cuffed his own hands behind his back and superstitiously released himself with the key, which he hid between his fingers. He then offered to show his intended victim how to release himself from the handcuffs, with his victim manaclined and unable to free himself. Gacy then made a statement to the effect that the trick is you have to have the key. Gacy referred to this act of restraining his victim as the handcuff trick. Having restrained his victim, Gacy proceeded to assault and torture his captive. He frequently began by sitting and or straddling himself above his victim's chest before forcing the victim to fellatio him or something. Gacy then inflicted acts of torture, including burning with cigars, making his captive intimidate a horse, imitate a horse, as he sat on their back and pulled upon makeshift reins around their necks in violation with foreign objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after he had sodomized his captive. To immobilize his captive's legs before engaging in acts of torture, Gacy frequently malinclined their ankles to a 4x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, an act inspired by the Houston mass murderers. He is also known to have verbally taunted many of his victims throughout their continued abuse and to have dragged or forced several victims to crawl into his bathroom where he partially drowned them in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them, enabling him to continue his prolonged assault. In instances when a victim had pleaded to be killed as opposed to continue to endure torture, Gacy would make a statement to the effect he would kill his victim when he wanted to. Gacy typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their neck before progressively tightening the rope with a hammer handle. He referred to this act as the rope trick, frequently informing his captive this is the last trick. In at least one instance, he had read part of Psalm 23 as he tightened the rope around his victim's neck. Occasionally, the victim had to convulse for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep into their throat. Except for his two final victims, all were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. After death, Gacy usually stored the victim's body under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying his victim in the crawl space, where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten the decomposition of his victims. Some victims' bodies were taken to his garage and embalmed prior to their burial. Murder of Timothy McCoy. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3, 1972. According to Gacy's later account, following a family party on the evening of January 2nd, he decided to drive to the Civic Center in the Loop to view a display of ice sculptures in the early hours of the following morning. He then lured a 16-year-old named Timothy Jake McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. McCoy was returning from a Christmas vacation in Michigan to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him to his home with the promise that he would spend the night and be driven back to the station in time to catch his bus. Prior to McCoy's identification, he was known simply as the Greyhound busboy. Gacy claimed he woke early the following morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway with a kitchen knife in his hand. He then jumped from his bed and McCoy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, titling the knife upwards and accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy twisted the knife from McCoy's wrist, banged his head against the bedroom wall, kicked him against his wardrobe, and walked towards him. McCoy then kicked Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, shouting, "Motherfucker, I'll kill you." He then wrestled McCoy to the floor and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest as he straddled him. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw an unopened carton of eggs and a slab of unsliced bacon on his kitchen table. McCoy had also set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him up, while absent-mindedly carrying the kitchen knife in his hand. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview several years later after his arrest, Gacy said that immediately after killing McCoy, he felt totally drained. He had noted that he had stabbed McCoy, and as he listened to the gurgations and gasping for air, that he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Second murder. Gacy said the second time he committed murder was around January 1974. This victim remains unidentified. Gacy strangled him and then placed the body in his closet before burial. He later stated that the bodily fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. As a result, Gacy regularly stuffed clothes rags in the victim's own underwear or a sock into the mouths of subsequent victims to prevent such a leakage from occurring. Murder of John Buchovich. On July 31st, 1975, John Buchovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee from Lombard, disappeared. Buchovich's car was found parked near the corner of Sheridan and Lawrence, with his jacket and wallet inside, the keys still in the ignition. The day before his disappearance, Buchovich had confronted Gacy over 2 weeks' outstanding back pay. Buchovich's father, a Yugoslavic immigrant, called Gacy, who claimed he was happy to help search for his son, but was sorry Buchovich had run away. When questioned by police, Gacy said Buchovich and his two friends had arrived at his house demanding the overdue pay, but they had reached a compromise and all three had left. Over the following 3 years, Buchovich's parents called police more than 100 times, urging them to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted to encountering Vucevic exiting his car at the corner of West Lawrence Avenue, waving to attract his attention. According to Gacy, Vucevic approached his car stating, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited Vucevic to his car, then invited him back to his home, ostensibly to settle the issue of his overdue wages. At his home, Gacy offered Vucevic a drink, then conned him into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy later confessed to having sat on the kid's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed Vucevic's body in the garage, intending to bury the body later in the crawl space. When his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, Gacy buried Vucevic's body under the concrete floor of the tool room extension of his garage in an empty space where he had initially intended to dig a drain tile. Cruising years. In addition to being the year his business expanded, Gacy freely admitted 1975 was also when he began to increase the frequency of his excursions for sex with young males. He often referred to these jaunts as cruising. Gacy committed most of his murders between 1976 and 1978, as he largely lived alone following his divorce. He later referred to these as his cruising years. Although Gacy remained gregarious and civic-minded, several neighbors noticed erratic changes in his behavior after his 1976 divorce. This included seeing him keeping company with young males, hearing his car arrive at a part in the early hours of the morning, or seeing lights in his home switch on and off in the early hours. One neighbor later recollected that for several years the sounds of muffled, high-pitched screaming, shouting, and crying had repeatedly been awakened her and her son in the early morning hours. She identified the sounds as emanating from a house adjacent to theirs on West Somerdale Avenue. 1976. 1 month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Darrell Sampson. He was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6, 1976. Gacy buried him under the dining room with a section of cloth lodged in his throat. 5 weeks later, on the afternoon of May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared shortly after returning to his uptown home from a dental appointment. He was last seen by his grandmother. Later that afternoon, hours after Reffitt was last seen by his family, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. He and Reffitt were close acquaintances. Both were buried together in the crawl space, and investigators believe the two were murdered the same evening. On June 3rd, Gacy killed a 17-year-old Lakeview teenager named Michael Bonin. He disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Wannagan. Gacy strangled Bonin with a ligature and buried him under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy murdered a 16-year-old uptown youth named William Carroll and buried him in a common grave in the crawl space. Carroll seems to have been the first of 4 victims known to have been murdered between June 13th and August 6, 1976. 3 were between 16 and 17 years old, and 1 unidentified murder victim appears to have been an adult. On August 5th, a 16-year-old Minnesota youth named James Hankinson is last known to have phoned his family, possibly from Gacy's home. Hankinson died of suffocation. His body was buried in the crawl space beneath the body of a 17-year-old Bentonville youth named Rick Johnston, who was last seen alive on August 6th. Gacy is thought to have murdered 2 further unidentified males between August and October 1976. On October 24th, Gacy abducted and killed teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. The 2 were last seen outside a restaurant on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, a 19-year-old construction worker, William Bundy, disappeared. After informing his family he was to attend a party, Bundy died of suffocation. Gacy buried the body beneath his master bedroom. He had apparently worked for Gacy. Between November and December 1976, Gacy murdered a 21-year-old named Francis Alexander. His last contact with his family was a phone call to his mother made sometime in November. Alexander was buried in the crawl space directly beneath the room Gacy used as his office. In December 1976, another PDM employee, 17-year-old Gregory Godsick, disappeared. His girlfriend last saw him outside her house after he had driven her home following a date. Godsick had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks before he disappeared. He had informed his family that Gacy had him dig trenches for some kind of drain tiles in his crawl space. Godsick's car was later found abandoned in Niles. His parents and older sister Eugenia contacted Gacy about Godsick's disappearance. Gacy claimed that he had run away from home, having indicated before that he wished to do so. Gacy also claimed to have received an answering machine message from Godsick, Shortly after he had disappeared, when asked if he could play it back, the message to God's six parents, Gacy said he had erased it. 1977. On January 20th, 1977, Gary lured 19-year-old John Syke to his house on the pretext of buying his Plymouth Satellite. He later confessed to strangling Syke in his spare bedroom, claiming Rossi was asleep in the house the following morning. Gacy later sold the car to Rossi for $300. 2 months later, on March 15th, a 20-year-old Michigan native named John Prestridge disappeared. Prestridge was last seen leaving a near North Side restaurant. He was buried in the crawl space above the body of Francis Alexander. Shortly before his disappearance, Prestridge had mentioned he obtained work with a local contractor. Gacy murdered one additional unidentified youth and buried him in the crawl space in the spring or early summer of 1977. The exact time of this murder is unknown. On July 5th, Gacy killed a 19-year-old from Crystal Lake, Matthew Bowman. Bowman's mother last saw him at the suburban train station. He had intended to travel to Harwood Heights for a scheduled court appointment regarding an unpaid parking ticket. The following month, Rossi was arrested for stealing gasoline while driving Syke's car. The gas station attendant noted the license plate, and police traced the car to Gacy's house. When questioned, Gacy told officers that Syke had sold the car to him in February, saying he needed the money to leave town. A check at the VIN confirmed the car belonged to Syke. The police did not pursue the matter further, although they did inform Syke's mother that her son had sold his car. By the end of 1977, it is known that Gacy had murdered 6 more young men between the ages of 16 and 21. The first of these victims was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, the son of a Chicago police sergeant, last seen alive on September 15th. Gilroy lived just 4 blocks from Gacy's house. He was murdered and buried in the crawl space. On September 12th, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to supervise a remodeling project and did not return to Chicago until September 16th. Because Gacy is known to have been in another state at the time of Gilroy's was last seen, this decided to support Gacy's claim of assistance from one or more accomplices in several homicides. 10 days after Gilroy was last seen, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Marwai disappeared after leaving his mother's house to walk to his apartment. Gacy strangled Marwai and buried his body beneath the master bedroom. On October 17, 21-year-old Minnesota native Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson was looking for contracting work. Gacy murdered him and buried him beneath the guest bedroom. Less than 4 weeks later, Gacy murdered a 16-year-old Kalamazoo teenager named Robert Winch. He buried him in the crawl space. On November 18, 20-year-old father of 1, Tommy Bowling, disappeared after leaving a Chicago bar. 3 weeks after the murder of Tommy Bowling, on December 9th, the 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Telsma disappeared after informing his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. Gacy strangled Telsma with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space, close to the body of John Marwai. On December 30th, Gacy abducted 19-year-old student Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy drove him to his home, where he assaulted and tortured and repeatedly dunked Donnelly's head into the bathtub until he passed out. Gacy taunted him with statements such as, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Donnelly later testified at Gacy's trial that he was in such pain that he asked Gacy to kill him. Gacy replied, "I'm getting around to that." After several hours, Gacy drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him, warning him that if he complained to police, they would not believe him. 1978. Donnelly reported the assault, and police questioned Gacy on January 6, 1978. Gacy admitted to having a slave sex relationship with Donnelly, but insisted everything was consensual, adding that he didn't pay the kid the money he had promised him. The police believed him and filed no charges. The following month, Gacy killed 19-year-old William Kindred, who disappeared on February 16th after telling his fiancée, who knew Gacy, that he was to spend the evening in a bar. Kindred was the final victim Gacy buried in his crawl space. On March 21st, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Ringel to his car. Shortly after Ringel entered the car, Gacy chloroformed him and drove him to his house, where his arms and head were restrained in a Pilroy device affixed to the ceiling and his feet locked into another device. Gacy explained to Ringel He had complete control over him and that he intended to do whatever he wanted to him when he wanted and how he wanted. He then assaulted and tortured Ringnahl with various instruments, including lit candles, whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him into unconsciousness. Gacy then drove Ringnahl to the Chicago's Lincoln Park, where he was dumped, unconscious but alive. Ringnahl managed to stagger to his girlfriend's apartment. Police were informed of the assault but did not investigate Gacy. Ringnahl was able to recall, through the haze of that night, the Oldsmobile, the Kennedy Expressway, the particular side streets. He and two friends staked out the Cumberland exit of the expressway in April. Ringnahl saw the Oldsmobile, which he and his friends followed, the 8213 West Somerdale. Police obtained an arrest warrant, and Gacy was arrested on July 15th. He faced trial for battery against Ringnahl. By 1978, the crawl space had no room for further bodies. Gacy later confessed to the police that he considered stowing bodies in his attic initially, but he had been worried about complications arising from leakage. Therefore, he chose to dispose of the victims off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy stated that he had thrown 5 bodies into this river in 1978, one of which he believed had landed on a passing barge. Only 4 bodies were ever found. The first known victim thrown from the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River was 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke. He was murdered in mid-June after leaving his Dover Street apartment to purchase cigarettes. Shortly before his disappearance, O'Rourke had told his roommate, a contractor on the northwest side, had offered him a job. On November 4th, Gacy killed a 19-year-old Frank Lannenden. His naked body was found close to an inlet in the Des Plaines River by 2 duck hunters in Canonoon on November 12th. On November 24th, a 20-year-old Elmwood Park resident, James Mazara, disappeared after sharing Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Mazara had informed his sister the day prior to his disappearance that he was working on the construction industry and doing all right. He was last seen alive, walking in the direction of Bughouse Square carrying a suitcase. Murder of Robert Piest. On the afternoon of December 11, 1978, Gacy visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the store owner, Phil Torf. While he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Piest, Gacy mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Piest earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after Gacy left the pharmacy, Piest's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home, so the family could celebrate her birthday together. Piest asked his mother to wait, adding that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. He left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Piest was murdered shortly after 10 p.m. at Gacy's home. Gacy later stated that at his house he asked Piest whether there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price, to which Piest replied that he did not mind working hard. In response, Gacy stated good money could be earned by hustling, although Piest was dismissive. Gacy then duped Piest into donning handcuffs before saying, "I'm going to assault you and you can't do anything about it." As Piest began weeping, he also stated that as he placed the rope around Piest's neck, the boy was crying, scared. Gacy admitted to having received a phone call from a business acquaintance as Piest lay dying, suffocating on his bedroom floor. Investigation. When Piest failed to return, his family filed a missing person report with the Des Plaines police. Torf named Gacy as the contractor Piest had most likely left the store to talk about a job with. Lieutenant Joseph Konizak, whose son attended Maine West High School, like Piest, chose to investigate Gacy further. Having spoken with Piest's mother in the morning of December 12th, Konizak became convinced Piest had not run away from home. A routine check of Gacy's criminal background revealed that he had an outstanding battery charge against him in Chicago and had served a prison sentence in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. Konizak and 2 Des Plaines officers visited Gacy at his home in the following evening. Gacy indicated he had seen 2 youths working at the pharmacy, and that he asked one of them, whom he believed to be Piest, whether there would be any remodeling materials behind the store. He was adamant, however, that he had not offered Piest a job. He only returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. as he left his appointment book at the store. Gacy promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement confirming this, indicating he was unable to do so at that moment as his uncle had just died. When questioned as to how soon he could come to the police station, he responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" At 3:20 a.m., Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been involved in a car accident. On returning to the police station later that day, Gacy denied any involvement in Piest's disappearance and repeated that he had not offered him a job. When asked why he had returned to the pharmacy, Gacy reiterated that he had done so in response to a phone call from Torf informing that he had left his appointment book at the store. Detectives have already spoken with Torf, who denied calling Gacy. At the request of detectives, Gacy prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11th. First search warrant. Suspecting Gacy might be holding peace against his will at his home, Des Plaines police obtained a warrant to search Gacy's house on December 13th. The search of Gacy's property revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges and a 6mm Brevada starter pistol inside an office drawer, and a syringe and a hypodermic needle inside a cabinet to Gacy's bathroom. Investigators also found handcuffs, several books on homosexuality and pederasty, with titles such as The Great White Swallow and Pretty Boys Must Die, 7 pornographic films, capsules of a male nyrite, and an 18-inch dildo in Gacy's bedroom, a 39 2x4 with 2 holes drilled into each end, bottle of Valium, atropine, and several driver's licenses were found in the northwest bedroom. A blue hooded parka was found atop a toolbox inside the laundry room, and underwear too small to fit Gacy was located inside a bathroom closet. In the northwest bedroom, investigators found the class of 1975 Maine West High School ring engraved with the initials JAS. Investigators also recovered a Nissan pharmacy photo receipt from a trash can, alongside a 36-inch section of nylon rope. Surveillance. The Des Plaines police confiscated Gacy's Oldsmobile and other PDM work vehicles. Police assigned two-man surveillance teams to monitor Gacy on a rational 12-hour basis as they continued their investigation into his background and potential involvement in Peace's disappearance. These surveillance teams consisted of officers Mike Albrat and David Heichmeister and Ronald Robinson and Robert Schultz. The following day, investigators received a phone call from Michael Rossi who informed the investigators of Gregory Godsick's disappearance and the fact that another PDM employee, Charles Hatula, had been found drowned in the Illinois River earlier that year. On December 15th, Des Plaines investigators obtained further details of Gacy's battery charge, learning the complaint Jeffrey Rignall had reported that Gacy had lured him to his car, and chloroformed him, assaulted him, and tortured him before dumping him with severe chest and facial burns and rectal bleeding in Lincoln Park the following morning. In an interview with Gacy's former wife the same day, they learned of the disappearance of John Vucevic. The same day, the Maine West High School ring was traced to a John Allen Syke. An interview with Syke's mother revealed that several items for her son's apartment were also missing, including a Motorola TV set. By December 16th, Gacy was becoming affable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or at his home. He repeatedly denied that he had anything to do with Peace's disappearance and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections or because of his recreational drug use. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he taunted them by floating traffic laws and succeeding in losing his pursuers more than once. That afternoon, Cram consented to a police interview in which he described Gacy's hard-working lifestyle and open-minded attitude about sex between men. Cram also revealed that because of his poor timekeeping, Gacy had once given him a watch, explaining he got it from a dead person. Investigators conducted a formal interview of Rossi on December 17th. He informed them Gacy had sold Syke's vehicle to him, explaining he had bought the car from Syke because he needed money to move to California. A further examination of Gacy's Oldsmobile was also conducted. On this date, in the course of examining the trunk of the car, investigators discovered a small cluster of fibers they suspected to be human hair. That evening, officers conducted a test using these three trained German Shepherd dogs to determine whether Peace had been present in any of Gacy's vehicles. One dog approached Gacy's Oldsmobile and lay on the passenger seat, and what the dog handler informed investigators was a death reaction, indicating Peace's body had been present in the vehicle. That evening, Gacy invited detectives Ulrich and Heichmeister to a restaurant for a meal. In the early hours of December 18th, he invited them into another restaurant where over breakfast he talked of his business, his marriages, his activities as a registered clown. At one point during the conversation, Gacy remarked, "You know, clowns can get away with murder. Civil suit." By December 18th, Gacy was beginning to display signs of strain from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired, appeared anxious, and was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they cease their surveillance. The same day, the serial number of the Nissan pharmacy photo receipt found in Gacy's kitchen was tracked to a 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a colleague of Peace at Nissan Pharmacy. Byers admitted when contacted in person the following day that she had worn the jacket on December 11th to shield herself from the cold. She had placed the receipt in the Parker pocket just before she gave the coat to Peace as he left the store, claiming a contractor wanted to speak with him. This statement contradicted Gacy's previous statements that he had no contact with Robert Peace on the evening of December 11th, second search warrant. The same evening, Rossi was interviewed as the second time. The time he was more cooperative. He informed detectives that in the summer of 1977, at Gacy's behest, he had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of Gacy's house. On December 19th, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant for Gacy's house. The same day, Gacy's lawyers filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The hearing for the suit was scheduled for December 22nd. That afternoon, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives inside his house again. As Officer Robson distracted Gacy with conversation, Officer Schultz walked into Gacy's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola TV set they suspected belonged to John Syke. While flushing Gacy's toilet, the officer noticed a smell he suspected could be that of rotting corpses emanating from a heating duct. The officers who had searched Gacy's house previously had failed to notice this, as the house had been cold. Investigators interviewed both Cram and Rossi on December 20th. Rossi had agreed to be interviewed in relation to his possible links with John Syke, as well as the disappearance of Robert Peace. When questioned by Konziak as to where he believed Gacy had concealed Peace's body, Rossi replied Gacy may have placed the body in the crawl space, adding that he thought Syke's car was stolen. Rossi agreed to submit to a polygraph test. He denied any involvement in Peace's disappearance, also denying any knowledge of his whereabouts. He soon refused to continue the questioning, and Rossi's erratic and inconsistent responses to questions while attached to the polygraph machine rendered Konziak unable to render a definite opinion as to the truthfulness of his answers. Rossi did, however, further discuss the trench digging he did in the crawl space and remarked on Gacy's insistence that he not deviate from where he was instructed to dig. Cram informed investigators of Gacy's attempts to assault him in 1976. He stated that he and Gacy had returned to his home after the December 13th search. Gacy had turned pale after seeing a clod of mud on his carpet, which he suspected had come from his crawl space. Cram said Gacy had grabbed a flashlight and immediately entered the crawl space to look for evidence of digging. When asked whether he had been to the crawl space, Cram replied he had once been asked by Gacy to spread lime down there, and also dug trenches, which Gacy explained were for drainage pipes. Cram said that these trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep, the size of graves. Confession. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting, ostensibly to discuss the progress of his civil suit. On his arrival, Gacy appeared disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink, whereupon Sam Amrite fetched a bottle of whiskey from his car. On his return, Amrite asked Gacy what he had to discuss with him. Gacy picked up a copy of the Daily Herald from Amrite's desk, pointed to a front-page article covering the disappearance of Robert Peace, and said, "This boy is dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began by informing Amrite and Stevens he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people, and that he now wanted to be the same for himself. He said he had murdered at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawl space. He had disposed of 5 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars to whom he gave the rope trick, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids on his floor, with their hands cuffed behind their back. He had buried their bodies in his crawl space, as he believed they were his property. As a result of the alcohol he had consumed, Gacy fell asleep midway through his confession. Amrite immediately arranged a psychiatric appointment for Gacy at 9 a.m. that morning. On awakening several hours later, Gacy shook his head when informed by Amrite he had confessed to killing approximately 30 people, saying, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I got things to do." Ignoring his lawyer's advice regarding his scheduled appointment, Gacy left their office to attend the needs of his business. Gacy later recollected his memories of his final day of freedom as being hazy, adding he knew his arrest was inevitable and that he intended to visit his friends and say his final farewells. After leaving his lawyer's office, Gacy drove to a gas station where, in the course of filling his rental car, he handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag to the surveillance officers, adding that Gacy had told him, "The end is coming for me. These guys are going to kill me." Gacy then drove to the home of a fellow contractor and friend, Ronald Rode. Gacy hugged Rode before bursting into tears and saying, "I've been a bad boy. I've killed 30 people, give or take a few." Gacy left Rode and drove to Cram's house to meet with Cram and Rossi. As he drove along the expressway, the surveillance officers noted he was holding a rosary to his chin, praying while he drove. After talking with Cram and Rossi, Gacy had Cram drive to a scheduled meeting with lawyer Leroy Stevens on the northwest side. As Gacy spoke with Stevens, Cram informed the surveillance officers that Gacy had told him and Rossi that he confessed to over 30 murders and his lawyers the previous evening. Gacy then had Cram drive to Mary Hill Cemetery where his father was buried. As Gacy drove to various locations that morning, police outlined the formal draft of their second search warrant, specifically to search for the body of Robert Peace in the crawl space. On hearing from the surveillance detectives that in the light of this erratic behavior, Gacy might be about to commit suicide, police decided to arrest him on the charge of possession and distribution of cannabis in order to hold him in custody, as the formal request for a second search warrant was presented. At 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, the eve of the hearing of Gacy's civil suit, Judge Marvin J. Peters granted the request for a second search warrant. After police informed Gacy of their intentions to search his crawl space for the body of Peace, Gacy denied the teenager was buried there, but confessed to having killed in self-defense a young man whose body was buried under his garage. Armed with the signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home. On their arrival, officers found Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, flooding the crawl space with water. To clear it, they simply replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. After it had done so, evidence technician Daniel Genty entered the 28 by 38 foot crawl space, crawled to the southwest area, and began digging. Within minutes, he had uncovered putrefied flesh and a human arm bone. Genty immediately shouted to the investigators that they could charge Gacy with murder, adding, "I think this place is full of kids." A police photographer then dug in the northeast corner of the crawl space, uncovering a patella. The two then began digging in the southeast corner, uncovering two lower leg bones. The victims were too decomposed to be pieced. As the body discovered in the northeast corner was later unearthed, a crime scene technician discovered the skull of a second victim alongside this body. Later excavations of the feet, the second victim revealed a further skull beneath the body. Because of this, technicians returned to the trench where the first body was unearthed, discovering the rib cage of a fourth victim within the crawl space, confirming the scale of the murders. Arrest. After being informed that the police had found human remains in his crawl space, and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air, adding he had known his arrest was inevitable since the previous evening, which he had spent on the couch in his lawyer's office. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, and in the presence of his lawyers, Gacy provided a formal statement in which he confessed to murdering approximately 30 young males, all of whom he claimed he had entered his house willingly. Some victims were referred to by name, but Gacy claimed to not know or remember most of the names. He claimed all were teenage runaways or male prostitutes, the majority of whom he had buried in his crawl space. Gacy claimed to have dug only 5 of the victims' graves in this location and had his employees, including Gregory Gonsick, dig the remaining trenches so that he would have graves available. One victim hailed from Round Lake. Another had been a Michigan native. When shown a driver's license issued to Robert Haston, which had been found on his property, Gacy claimed to not know him, but admitted that his license had been in the possession of one of his victims. In January 1979, he had planned to conceal the corpses even further by covering the entire crawl space with concrete. When questioned specifically about Peace, Gacy confessed to luring him to his house, strangling him on the evening of December 11th. He also admitted to having slept alongside Peace's body that evening, before disposing of the corpse in the Des Plaines River in the early hours of December 13th. On his way to the police station, he had been in a minor traffic accident. After disposing of Peace, his vehicle had slid off an ice-covered road and had to be towed from its location. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23rd to pinpoint the precise spot where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert Peace and 4 other victims into the Des Plaines River. Gacy was then taken to his house and instructed to mark his garage floor with orange spray paint to show where he had buried the individual. he had supposedly killed in his self-defense, whom he named as John Bucevich. Search for victims. Crawl space. To assist officers in their search for the victims buried beneath his house during his confession, Gacy drew a rough diagram of his basement on a phone message sheet to indicate where their bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from Gacy's crawl space over the next week. 3 more were also unearthed elsewhere on his property. Cook County Medical Examiner Robert Stein supervised the exhumations. Each victim unearthed from the crawl space was placed in a body bag, which was placed near the front door, awaiting transportation to the mortuary. The crawl space was marked in sections, and each body was given an identifying number. The first body recovered from the crawl space was assigned a mark or detonating the victim as Body 1. Gacy had buried this victim in the northeast section of the crawl space, directly beneath the room he used as his office. No cause of death could be determined. The body of John Bucevich was labeled as Body 2. On December 23rd, investigators returned to unearth the 3 corpses which had been buried in the same trench as Body 1. Body 3 was buried in the crawl space directly above Body 4. Alongside them, Body 5 was buried directly beneath Body 1. The victim was buried 36 inches below the surface of the soil, indicating he was the first descendant to be buried in this common grave. The search for the victims was postponed temporarily over Christmas. 4 more bodies were unearthed on December 26th. Bodies numbers 6 and 7 were buried in the same grave. Body 7 was found in a fetal position. A cloth gag was found in the mouth, leading investigators to conclude this victim most likely died of asphyxiation. Body 8 was found with a tourniquet used to strangle him, still knotted around his neck. Body 9 was found beneath a layer of concrete and was found to have several stab wounds to the ribs and sternum, suggesting he was Gacy's first victim. On December 27th, 8 more bodies were discovered. Body 10 was buried face upwards, parallel to the wall of the crawl space directly beneath the entrance to Gacy's home. Both Body 11 and Body 12 were found face downwards with a ligature around their neck, and both were buried beside each other in the center of the crawl space directly beneath the hallway. Body 13 was found beneath the spare bedroom. Body 14 and 15 were recovered from a common grave diagonal to Body 10. Both 14 and 15 were found with their head and upper torsos inside separate plastic bags. Body 16 was found close to Body 13, although in a separate trench further north of the south wall. This victim was found with a cloth rag lodged deep in his throat, causing him to die of suffocation. The 17th victim was found with a ligature around his neck. The following day, 4 more bodies were exhumed. Body 19 was buried directly beneath Gacy's master bedroom, perpendicular to Body 18, which was located beneath the spare bedroom and found with a ligature around the neck. Body 20 was buried in the northwest corner of the crawl space, perpendicular to Body 19. By December 29th, 6 more bodies were unearthed. Bodies 22, 23, 24, and 26 were buried in a common grave located beneath Gacy's kitchen and laundry room, with Body 25 located beneath Gacy's bathroom. Body 22 was found directly beneath Gacy's kitchen with a section of cloth-like material lodged in his throat. 2 socks were recovered from the pelvic region. This victim was buried directly beneath Body 21, recovered the previous day. The bones of victims 23 and 24 were commingled together, and a section of cloth was found inside the mouth of bodies 24 and 26. Body 25 was found beneath Gacy's bathroom with a section of cloth lodged in the throat. The final victim recovered from the crawl space was also found beneath the bathroom. Buried 10 inches below the surface of the soil, this victim was found to have a section of cloth lodged deep in his throat. Operations were suspended due to the Chicago blizzard of 1979, but resumed in March despite Gacy's insistence that all the buried victims had been found. On March 9th, Body 28 was found wrapped within several plastic bags and buried beneath the patio approximately 15 feet from the barbecue pit in Gacy's backyard. On March 16th, Body 29 was found beneath the dining room floor. All the victims discovered at 8213 West Summerdale were in an advanced state of decomposition. Dental records and x-ray charts helped Stein identify the remains. 23 victims were identified via dental records, with 2 further victims identified via skeletal trauma. These identifications were also supported with personal artifacts found in Gacy's home. The head and upper torso of 7 bodies unearthed beneath Gacy's property had been placed into plastic bags. Several were also found with a rope still around their necks. In some cases, bodies were found with foreign objects such as prescription bottles lodged into their pelvic region, the position of which indicated the victims had been thrust into the victim's anus. Stein concluded 12 victims recovered from Gacy's property died not of strangulation but of asphyxiation. Gacy's vacant house was demolished in April 1979. The victim, found 6 miles downstream from the I-55 bridge on June 30th, was not connected initially to Gacy. In January 1979, this victim was identified using fingerprints, records, and distinctive tattoo on his left biceps reading Tim Lee as a homage to Bruce Lee as Timothy O'Rourke. An autopsy was unable to rule out strangulation as the cause of death. This victim was numbered 31. Following Gacy's arrest, investigators discovered he was a further victim. Frank Lanigan's cause of death was certified at autopsy as suffocation through his own underwear being lodged down his throat, plugging his airway and effectively causing him to drown in his own vomit. He was assigned victim number 32. On December 28th, one further body linked to Gacy was found 1 mile from the I-55 bridge. This victim was identified as James Mazzara, whom Gacy confessed to having murdered shortly after Thanksgiving. Mazzara had been strangled with a ligature. On April 9, 1979, a man walking along a Grundy County towpath discovered a decomposed body entangled in exposed roots on the edge of Des Plaines River. The body was identified via dental records as being that of Robert Peast. The same evening, a subsequent autopsy revealed there were 3 wads of paper-like material that had been shoved down his throat while he was still alive, causing him to suffocate. Trial. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garpo. The jury was selected from Rockford because of extensive press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Mandarin Correctional Center in Chester. In the year before his trial, he underwent a variety of psychological tests before a panel of psychiatrists to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hard-working, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and the policeman called Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality, viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity to the charges against him, presenting Gacy as a Jekyll Hyde character. The defense produced several psychiatric experts who had examined Gacy. 3 psychiatric experts had Gacy's trial testified they found him to be paranoid, schizophrenic, with multiple personalities. The prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. To support this contention, they produced several witnesses to testify to the premeditation of Gacy's actions and the efforts he took to escape detection. Those doctors refuted the defense's doctors' claims of multiple personalities and insanity. Cram and Rossi testified that Gacy had made them dig drainage trenches and spread bags of lime in his crawl space. Both said Gacy looked periodically into the crawl space to ensure they and the other employees that they had supervised did not deviate from the previous locations he had marked. On February 18th, Robert Stein testified that all the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were markedly decomposed and putrefied skeletalized remains. And in all the autopsy he performed, 13 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of ligature strangulation, 1 of multiple stab wounds to the chest, and 10 in undetermined ways. When Gacy's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxia, Stein called this highly improbable. Jeffrey Rignall testified on behalf of the defense on February 21st, recounting his ordeal. Rignall wept repeatedly while describing Gacy's torture of him in March 1978. Asked whether Gacy appreciated the criminality of his actions, Rignall said he believed that Gacy was unable to conform his actions to the law's expectations because of the beastly and animalistic way he attacked him. During specific cross-examination relating to the torture, Rignall vomited and was excused from further testimony. On February 29th, Donald Voorhees, whom Gacy had sexually assaulted in 1967, testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hand and his subsequent attempts to dissuade him from testifying by paying another youth to spray mace in his face and beat him. Voorhees felt unable to testify, but did briefly attempt to do so before being asked to step down. Robert Donnelly testified the week after Voorhees, recounting his ordeal at Gacy's hands in December 1977. Donnelly was visibly distressed as he recalled the abuse he endured and came close to breaking down several times. As Donnelly testified, Gacy repeatedly laughed at him, but Donnelly finished his testimony. During Donnelly's cross-examination, one of Gacy's defense attorneys, Robert Moda, attempted to discredit his testimony, but Donald did not waver from his testimony of what occurred. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garpo requesting a mistrial for reasons including that he did not approve of his lawyers' insanity plea, that his lawyers would not allow him to take the witness stand as he wanted to do, that his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, that the police were lying with regard to verbal statements he had allegedly made to the detectives after his arrest, and in any event, statements were self-serving for use by the prosecution. Judge Garpo addressed Gacy's letter by informing him that both counsels had not been denied the opportunity or funds to summon expert witnesses to testify, that under the law he had the choice whether he wished to testify and was free to indicate as much to the judge as he wished to do so. Closing arguments. On March 11th, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. They concluded the following day. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan spoke first, outlining Gacy's history of abusing youths, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection, and describing his surviving victims, Voorhees and Donnelly, as living dead. Referring to Gacy as the worst of all murderers, Sullivan stated, John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. After the state's 4-hour closing counsel, Sam Armourite spoke for the defense. Armourite argued against the testimony delivered by the doctors who had testified for the prosecution, repeatedly citing the testimony of the 4 psychiatrists and psychologists who had testified on behalf of the defense. Armourite also accused Sullivan of scarcely referring to the evidence presented throughout the trial in his own closing argument, and of arousing hatred against his client. The defense lawyer attempted to portray Gacy as a man driven by compulsions he was unable to control, contending the state had not met their burden of proving Gacy sane beyond a reasonable doubt. In support of these arguments, the defense referred to the testimony of the doctors who had appeared at the defense, in addition to the defense witnesses Jeffrey Rignall and a former business associate of Gacy's named Michael Reed, both of whom had testified to the belief that Gacy had been unable to control his actions. Armourite then urged the jury to put aside any prejudice they had against his client and asked to deliver a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, and that Gacy was a danger to both himself and to others, and that the studying of psychological behavior would be one of the benefits to science. On the morning of March 12th, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution. Kunkel referred to the defense's contention of insanity as a sham, arguing that the facts of the case demonstrated Gacy's ability to think logically and control his actions. Kunkel also referred to the testimony of one of the doctors who had examined Gacy in 1968 and concluded he was an antisocial personality, capable of committing crimes without remorse and unlikely to benefit from social or psychiatric treatment, stating that the recommendations of this doctor had not been heeded. Gacy, if these doctors was heeded, Gacy would not have been freed. At the close of his argument, Kunkel removed photos of Gacy's 22 unidentified victims from a display board and asked the jury not to show sympathy, but to show justice. Kunkel then asked the jury to show the same sympathy this man showed when he took these lives and put them there, before throwing the stack of photos into the opening of the trapdoor from Gacy's crawl space, which had been introduced as evidence and was on display in the courtroom. After Kunkel had finished his testimony, the jury retired and considered their verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Gacy guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both convictions in reference to Robert Peast. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed after the Illinois statute of capital punishment came into effect in June 1977. His execution was set for June 2nd, 1980. Death row. On being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Rant Correctional Center, where he remained incarcerated on death row for 14 years. Before his trial, Gacy initiated contact with WLS-TV journalist Russ Ewing, to whom he granted numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Ewing later collaborated with the author Tim Cahill to publish the book Buried Dreams. The information Gacy divulged to Ewing regarding the circumstances of his first murder would prove instrumental in establishing the identity of his first victim. On February 15, 1983, Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 killer, stabbed Gacy in the upper arm with a sharpened wire as Gacy was participating in a voluntary work program. A second death row inmate injured in the attack, William Jones, received a superficial stab wound to the head, Both received treatment in the prison hospital for their wounds. Appeals. After his incarceration, Gacy read numerous law books and filed voluminous motions and appeals, although he did not prevail in any of them. His appeals related to issues such as the validity of the first search warrant granted to Des Plaines police on December 13, 1978, his objection to his lawyer's insanity plea defense at his trial. Gacy also contended that although he had some knowledge of the 5 of the murders, those of McCoy, Buchevich, Godsick, Syke, and Peast, the other 28 murders had been committed by employees who had keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14th. Gacy filed an appeal against the decision, which was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court on March 4, 1985. The following year, Gacy filed a further post-conviction petition seeking a new trial. His then-defense lawyer, Richard Kling, argued that Gacy had been provided with ineffective legal counsel in his 1980 trial. His post-conviction petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. Gacy appealed to the 1985 decision to be executed. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction on September 29, 1988, setting a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10, 1994. Execution. On the morning of May 9, 1994, Gacy was transferred from the Monroe Correctional Center to Statesville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family for his last meal. Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That evening, he observed a prayer with a Catholic priest before being escorted to the Statesville execution chamber to receive a lethal injection. Before the execution began, the chemicals used to effect the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the IV tube used to administer the chemicals into Gacy's arm, complicating the procedure. Blinds covering the window through which witnesses observed the execution were drawn. The execution team replaced the clogged tube. After 10 minutes, the blinds were reopened and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution, saying that had correct execution procedures been followed, the complications would never have occurred. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. On this subject, one prosecutor at Gacy's trial, William Kunkel, said he got a much easier death than any of his victims. According to published reports, Gacy was diagnosed with psychopath who did not express any remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. A vocal majority in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some of those in the favor of the execution wore T-shirts harkening to Gacy's previous community service as a clown and bearing sexual slogans such as "No tears for the clown." The anti-death penalty protesters observed a silent candlelight vigil. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who was interviewed by Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated. Victims. Unidentified victims. Only 28 of Gacy's victims have been conclusively identified. Of these, the youngest were Samuel Stapleton and Michael Moreno, both 14. The eldest were Francis Alexander and Russell Nelson, both 21. 5 victims have never been identified. The first victims to be identified were John Buchevich, body 2, John Syke, body 3, and Gregory Godsick, body 4. Dental records confirmed their identities on December 29, 1978. The 33rd victim linked to Gacy, James Mazara, was identified the following day. The 23rd victim, exhumed from Gacy's property, was identified as Rick Johnson on January 1st, 1979. 4 further victims were identified on January 6, 1979. Body 18 was identified as Michael Bonin, and body 25 as Robert Kilroy. The first victim exhumed from the crawl space was identified as John Partridge, and the victim labeled body 16 is Russell Nelson. A fishing license issued to Bonin had been found previously in Gacy's home. 3 days later, the victim recovered from the Des Plaines River on June 30th, 1978, was identified as Timothy O'Rourke. On January 27th, dental charts were used to identify body 20 as John Mowry. 2 days later, body 8 was identified as Matthew Bowman. 2 months later, on March 17, 1979, the 22nd victim recovered from Gacy's property was identified using dental records as William Carroll. The following month, the identity of the 7th victim was confirmed using X-ray records as Randall Reffitt. And on May 21st, dental records confirmed that body 27 was William Kindred. On December 11, 1979, bodies 11 and 12 were identified as Robert Winch and Tommy Bowling, respectively. Winch was identified via X-ray records of a distinctive heel bone fracture. A distinctive brown tiger's eye metal buckle with black striping belonging to Winch was also found alongside his body. Using dental records, the 6th victim exhumed from Gacy's property was identified on November 14, 1979 as Samuel Stapleton. On November 16th, body 17th was identified as David Towsome using radiology of the healed fracture of the left scapula. 2 days later, the final victim recovered from Gacy's property, body 29, was identified as Darrell Sampson. On March 29, 1980, bodies 14 and 15 were identified using dental records and radiology, both of those of Michael Moreno and Kenneth Parker. Their identities were confirmed too late to include among the victims identified before Gacy's trial. In May 1986, the 9th victim exhumed from Gacy's properties was identified as Timothy Jake McCoy, Gacy's first victim. Dental records and a distinctive belt buckle assisted with his identification. Renewed efforts. In October 2011, Cook County Sheriff Thomas Dart announced that investigators obtained full DNA profiles from each of the unidentified victims and will renew their efforts to identify them. In a press conference held to announce this, Sheriff Dart stated investigators are actively seeking DNA samples from individuals across the United States related to any male missing between 1970 and 1979. As a result, results of tests conducted thus far have confirmed the identification of 3 victims, ruled out the possibility of numerous other victims used as being victims of Gacy, and solved from related cold cases dating between 1972 and 1979. In November 2011, the victim previously known as Body 19 was identified through DNA testing as William Bundy. Shortly after Gacy's arrest, Bundy's family had contacted his dentist in the hope of submitting his dental records for comparison with the unidentified bodies, but the records had been destroyed after his dentist had been retired. In July 2017, 16-year-old James Hannison, previously known as Body 24, was also identified as the victim using DNA testing. The most recent victim to be identified is 21-year-old Francis Wayne Alexander, previously known as Body 5. Alexander was identified via forensic genealogy in October 2021. He had not been reported missing by his family, who believed he had been relocated from Chicago to California shortly after his final contact with his mother in November 1976. Unidentified victims. 5 victims still remain unidentified, 4 of whom who had been buried beneath Gacy's crawl space, and 1 buried approximately 15 feet from the barbecue pit in his backyard in the fall of 1979. Forensic expert Betty Pat Gatliff used the skulls of the remaining unidentified victims to create facial reconstructions. Based on Gacy's confession, the location of the victims buried in the crawl space, and forensic analysis, police determined the most likely dates for when his unidentified victims were killed. Gacy's likely second murder victim, Body 28, had brown hair, stood approximately 5 feet 9 in height, and is estimated to be between 14 and 18. He was buried near Gacy's barbecue pit, possibly in 1975. He wore a silver ring on his left ring finger, suggesting he may have been married. Body 26 was a man with a medium dark brown hair, estimated to have been aged between 23 and 30 years old, and approximately 5'4" in height. This man had 2 missing upper front teeth, leading investigators to believe he had likely wore a denture. He was almost certainly murdered between June 13th and August 5th, 1976. Body 13 was a man likely to have been murdered between August and October 1976. He was between 5'9" and 6'2" in height. He had long, dark brown hair, wavy hair, and was between 17 and 22 years old. This victim is known to have suffered from an abscessed tooth and may have injured his left third rib months or years before his disappearance. While Rossi also claimed to have dug this grave in the late summer of 1977, Cram claimed that during this time, living at 8213 West Summerdale, Gacy had him dig a trench in the northwest corner of the crawl space where his victim was recovered. In 2018, an updated facial reconstruction released to the media. Body 21 is estimated to have been aged between 15 and 24 years old and approximately 5 foot 10 in height. He had light brown hair. His victim was buried directly above the body of William Carroll, indicating his murder occurred on or after June 13, 1976. It is theorized Graham may not have lived with Gacy at the time of this victim's death, so it was a possible date for the murders between August 6th and the 20th, 1976. Although investigators have not discounted the possibility he had may have murdered later than 76. Body 10 is estimated to have been aged between 17 and 21 years old and between 5 foot 7 and 5 foot 11 and had suffered a fractured left collarbone months or years before his disappearance. The two victims, murdered on the same day in May 1976, were buried alongside him. Yet substantial sequential burial patterns of three victims murdered in 1977 leave an equal possibility he may have been murdered in the summer of 77. Statements made by Gacy following his arrest also suggest this unidentified victim may have been murdered as early as 1974. In 2018, an updated facial reconstruction was released to the media. Possible additional victims. At the time of Gacy's arrest, he had claimed to both Des Plaines Chicago investigators that the total number of murder victims could be as high as 45. However, only 33 victims were ever linked to Gacy. Investigators excavated the grounds of his property until they had exposed the subterranean clay beneath the foundations, finding 29 bodies. Shortly after his arrest, Gacy informed investigators that he had assaulted and released Jeffrey Rignall in March 1978. He began to throw his murder victims into the Des Plaines River. He confessed to having disposed of 5 bodies in this manner. However, only 4 bodies were recovered from the Des Plaines River were linked to him. When he asked whether there were more victims, Gacy stated, "That's for you guys to find out." Identification dispute of Michael Moreno. Disputed DNA and dental tests conducted between 2012 and 2016 indicate that neither body found in the common grave in Gacy's crawl space and identified as though Kenneth Parker and Michael Moreno in 1980 was actually Moreno. Moreno's mother had also doubted her son's identification because of the clothing found in the body. 14 was inconsistent with what he had worn when he was last seen. DNA testing conducted upon the exhumed body of Parker had proven that Moreno's body had not been mistaken for his. In addition, the dental x-ray conducted on the victim identified as Michael Moreno had revealed that all of their second molars. A dental x-ray conducted on Moreno in March 1976 revealed one molar had not erupted. The original identification of the body, identified as Michael Moreno, has been disputed because the exhumed body had neither an upper or lower jawbone. Nonetheless, the orthodontist who had identified Moreno's remains stated his conviction in the accuracy of his findings, adding he had compared 32 teeth, probably half a dozen of them had very distinct fillings, and every one of them was consistent with Michael Moreno. Death of Charles Hatula. On May 23, 1978, 25-year-old Charles Anton Matula was found drowned in the Pitacona River near Freeport, Illinois. He had been missing since May 13th. Atula was an employee of PDM and had been linked to the initial investigation of Gacy after Michael Rossi informed investigators of both Godsick's disappearance and Hatula's death. Moreover, Rossi had stated that Hatula was known to have conflicts with Gacy, and when he had failed to show up at work, Gacy informed him and several employees that he had drowned. At the time of Hatula's death, no more bodies had been stored in Gacy's crawl space, with at least a possibility he had disposed of Hatula's body in the Pitacona River. However, Des Plaines authorities had contacted Freeport during their investigation into Gacy and were told Hatula had fallen to his death from a bridge. Hatula's death has been officially ruled as asphyxia by drowning. West Miami Avenue. Retired Chicago police officer Bill Dortch stated that he had no reason to believe there might be more victims buried in the grounds of the apartment building located at the 600 block of the West Miami Avenue, Chicago, a property where Gacy is known to have been the caretaker for several years before 1978. In 1975, Dortch, a Chicago police officer, observed Gacy, whom he knew on a casual basis, holding a shovel in the early hours of the morning. When Dortch confronted him, Gacy said he was doing work, he was too busy doing it during the day. Dortch also said that several of the residents of the Miami Avenue stated that he had seen Gacy digging trenches in the grounds of the property in the early to mid-70s. One of these residents also said that Gacy later placed plants in the elongated trenches he had dug. At the time the accident was observed, Gacy was still married to Carol Hoff. In March 2012, Cook County Sheriff's officials submitted a request to excavate the grounds of this property. The Cook County State Attorney denied the request, citing lack of probable cause as the reason, including the results of a 1998 search of the property. However, the Sheriff's Office noted that in 1998, a radar survey team suggested 14 areas of interest within the property grounds. Yet only 2 of these 14 anomalies have been excavated. Of the 12 remaining anomalies, 4 were described as being staggeringly suggestive of human skeletons. Moreover, Bill Dortch had provided police with a letter from the radar company which confirmed the 1998 search of the grounds was incomplete. The second request to excavate the grounds of West Miami Avenue was submitted to the Cook County State's Attorney by Sheriff Tom Dart in October 2012. This request was granted in 2013, and a search of the property was conducted in the spring. Both FBI sniffer dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment were used in the second search of West Miami Avenue. However, the search yielded no human remains. Potential accomplices. One of the first things Gacy told an investigator after his arrest was that he had not acted alone in several of the murders. He asked whether my associates had been arrested. When questioned whether the associates had participated indirectly or indirectly in the killings, Gacy replied, directly. He later claimed that Cram and Rossi were involved in several of the murders. Some criminal defense attorneys and investigators researching the possibility Gacy had not acted alone in several of the murders have said there is overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. In the 1980s, Gacy informed FBI profiler Robert Ressler that 2 or 3 PDM employees had assisted in several murders. Ressler believed that there were unexplained avenues to the case and that Gacy had killed more than 33 victims in multiple states. Gacy neither confirmed nor denied Ressler's suspicions. Jeffrey Rignall, who had been assaulted and tortured by Gacy in March 1978, was adamant that at one point during his abuse and torture, a young man with brown hair had knelt before him and watched his abuse. Rignall also said that he saw a light come on in another part of the house. On one occasion, 3 days before his arrest, during the surveillance of Gacy, 2 officers followed him to a bar where he met 2 employees, Michael Rossi and Ed Hefner. An anxious Gacy was observed walking with the 2 out of earshot of the surveillance officers to talk privately before returning closer to the officers. Gacy said to both young men, "You better not let me down, you fuckers. You owe it to me." The officers then overheard sections of a hushed conversation between Gacy and the 2, during which Rossi asked Gacy, "And what? Buried like the other 5?" In interviews from death row, Gacy said that at the time of his arrest, 3 PDM employees were also considered suspects in the murders. All of them, he said, were in possession of keys to his house. In addition to Cram Rossi, Gacy named his former employee, Philip Passack, as someone who had known a close associate of John Norman and an acquaintance of David Cram in the late 1970s. Norman operated a nationwide sex trafficking ring based in Chicago known as the Delta Project. At least 2 victims believed to have been murdered by Gacy, Kenneth Parker and Michael Moreno, are known to have at least been seen alive close to where Norman lived. This led to the theory that Gacy had been connected to this trafficking ring. Later investigations. Gacy claimed that he was not in Chicago when 16 identified victims had disappeared in 2012. 2 Chicago lawyers said travel records show that he had been in another state at the time of the murders, implying that he was assisted by one or more of the accomplices. For example, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh via Albany Airlines 3 days before the disappearance of Robert Gilbert and returned to Chicago only 3 days after he disappeared. Investigators noted that Robert Young, his traveling companion, victim Russell Nelson, was visiting Chicago at the time of his October 1977 disappearance, gave differing accounts of his disappearance to Nelson's family and investigators. Young is known to have filed a missing persons report with Chicago police before unsuccessfully requesting money from Nelson's parents to finance a search for their son. When Nelson's 2 brothers arrived in Chicago to search for him, Young offered him a job with PDM. Young was never summoned to testify at Gacy's trial. In the third case, travel records indicate Gacy was at a scheduled job site in Michigan at 6 a.m. on September 26, 1977, the day following the disappearance of 19-year-old John Malroy, who was last seen leaving his mother's house at 10 p.m. on December 25th. Malroy's roommate was a PDM employee who formerly lived with Gacy and had moved into Malroy's apartment less than 1 week before Malroy's disappearance. 2 witnesses have stated that this roommate had suggested to Malroy that he met a man who was going out of town 2 days before Malroy disappeared. Amber Alert. In 1984, this is notoriety. Amber Alert. In 1984, Sam Amrite, one of Gacy's 2 defense attorneys at his 1980 trial, authored procedures that were incorporated by the Illinois General Assembly into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. Amrite was since said that the primary inspiration of legislation was that at the time of the Gacy murders, Illinois police had to wait 72 hours before initiating a search for a missing child or adolescent. The Illinois Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984 removed the 2-hour waiting period. Other states across America subsequently adopted similar procedures. As a result, a national network aimed at locating missing children was gradually formed. This has since developed into the child abduction emergency commonly known today as the Amber Alert. Paintings. Isolated in his prison cell, Gacy began to paint. He drew inspiration from a wide range of sources for his artwork, with his paintings depicting subjects as diverse as Christ, birds, skulls, his own home, and John Dillinger. Many paintings were of clowns, including himself as Pogo or Patches. His Hi-Ho series features scenes of Walt Disney's versions of the Seven Dwarfs. Although Gacy was permitted to earn money from the sale of his paintings until 1985, he claimed his artwork was intended to bring joy into people's lives. Many of Gacy's paintings have been displayed at these exhibitions. Others have been sold at various auctions, with individual price ranging between $200 to $20,000. Following Gacy's execution, family members of his victims publicly burned several of his paintings. And that is Rant reading A Serial Killer, John Wayne Gacy.